All right. Today is March the 28th in 2026, and my guest is Sid Sijbrandij. Sid is known as the co-founder of GitLab, a publicly listed software company, and today he's here with an incredible story. Sid, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Tell us your story.
Yeah, my story is that in 22, I got bone cancer and I did all the standard of care treatments. I had a lesion growing in my upper spine and we did surgery, radiation, chemo, trying to get rid of it. Also in 22, something else happened. Click Chemistry won a Nobel Prize. And coincidentally, had become the biggest investor in the first company to bring click chemistry to humans. And click chemistry is a technology where you can have a reaction in a human that's very specific. It happens very reliably. You don't have any side effects, any reactions that you don't want to. It's an awesome mechanism. And in my Y Combinator batch, there was a guy who was using it to get cancer drugs to target. And I thought that was a great idea. I started investing for small checks, but then nobody believed in it. All the biotech VCs is like, this is the only click chemistry company in the world. This is not going to work. So over time, I became his biggest investor. And now that I had cancer, I had a chance to become a patient. And he moved things. He had an amazing network, and we were able to get a single patient IND. We were able to get this drug outside of a big regular trial and do it just for me. And that opened up my eyes like, oh, it's not easy, but it's possible. Despite those efforts, 2 years later, 24, my cancer was back. It was growing. My oncologist did not have any treatments he would recommend to me. There was nothing left in standard of care. He said, maybe there's a trial. I looked for trials, but it's a relatively rare disease and there was nothing. And it was like an oh shit moment. So I quit my day job running the public software company. And I said, okay, what are we going to do? And I decided to do 4 things. I started doing every single diagnostic I could get my hands on. And it turns out there's a lot of diagnostics. There's not just a simple test. I did a test that tested for like 500 cancer mutations, but you can do whole genome sequencing. You can do RNA sequencing. You can do single cell. You can do spatial. You can do TCR sequencing. And I started doing just everything. We wouldn't know what we would need, but we started doing it. And if there were no medicines anymore, we started creating them. So we started developing more than 10 medicines with all kinds of different people. We also started to do treatments in parallel. Anything we came across that made sense, we started looking, hey, are the side effects profiles, like do they reinforce each other or are they different? If they're different, we can do the treatments at the same time. Because most people, I think, run out of time. And I think a lot of times if you do a cancer treatment, the tumor escapes the treatment and you do the new one, but it escapes that one too. And now you got metastasis. And by trying to do as much as is reasonable at the same time, you have a better shot at cure. And I think we learned that the industry as a whole is very conservative. Doctors and mostly hospitals are there to minimize liability. They don't want you to die basically from a side effect of one of the treatments. You as a patient have a very different incentive. You want to maximize survivability. In fact, I'd rather die of a potential cure than from cancer. Cancer is a very slow and miserable way to go. So recognizing that these incentives are different, you can see that the bar for combining treatments, in my view, is too high. typically doctors say, hey, we need a randomized controlled trial that shows that these things work together. These trials are extremely expensive. Getting a cancer drug approved is $2.7 billion. So you're not going to have that trial for many combinations. So instead, we went back to first principles. Like, do they hit different organs with their side effects? How do we feel? Maybe we also kind of were conservative on some of the doses because we were combining them. We had a pathologist in the loop who was really good at like looking at the different organs and the effects there. We also worked a lot with AI to try to reason through it. There's not a lot of data. There's no randomized trials, so you try to do it from first principles. The last thing we did is we discovered that there's a lot of things that were easier than I thought. It wasn't easy, but it was easier than I thought. And we try to make it accessible to other patients. Last year, I started 10 biotech companies that are patient first, in the sense that they want to get into patients within the first year, but also that the patients have to pay for it. Because a lot of these things, we're not doing the $2.7 billion approval process. And frequently the drugs are specific to the patient. Doesn't mean that they can't be used by someone else, but we're focused on the patient. The patient helps fund the R&D for the treatment. And some of these companies already gotten to 5 patients.
Yeah. So your doctor did not tell you to do all these things and do all these diagnostics, even though they were available, many of them?
Yes. I had a very good oncologist, and I'm very happy with my oncologist. I think as far as the industry goes, I was very lucky. I'm still in touch, and I still get his feedback on all the things I'm doing. He's always been very supportive. So I'm just to be clear, I was very lucky. What that doctor recommended at that academic hospital I was treated, there was a test to look at hundreds of cancer mutations. So I did that test. And when we kind of discussed more, it was like, yeah, you can do more sequencing, but it's unclear what you do with the data. Most of the stuff that is actionable is actually in our 100 mutation test.
Mm-hmm.
And we went the other way. We're just going to sequence everything, the whole genome, long sequencing, single, spatial. And we hope that more data will lead to more insight.
Mm-hmm.
And it did. I can tell you some stories, but it didn't lead to insight into things that had the randomized control trial, that were standard of care.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important
It did not have the insight into.
Sorry?
It did not have the insight into standard of care.
So those genetic tests that I was offered and did, it tests for 500 mutations, and almost all of these mutations, if you find them, there's something actionable.
Yep.
There is a standard of care thing, a proven randomized control trial tested thing that you can do.
In the standard tests, and because and vice versa. Like, why would you test for something you couldn't?
Exactly. Why would you test for something you're not willing to give?
Yeah, there wouldn't be a market for it for me. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, the reasoning is at this hospital, we only want to do proven things because otherwise we increase our liability.
Yeah.
We don't want that as a hospital.
So
only going to do tests that have a proven treatment.
Yeah. So you're looking for the key where the light falls.
I think it's a completely different mindset, and we're going to look at everything and see what is actionable. And for example, one thing I found through single cell sequencing was a treatment that's experimental in Germany, etc. Well, that was never going to be something the hospital would recommend to me. Like, these major great cancer centers will very rarely recommend something outside of their center. So you're restricting yourself to that center and basically to standard of care plus their trials. And if you have a rare disease like mine, It's it's very it's very unlikely you're included in any of the trials.
And that is true even in your case. You're an individual that's very accomplished and has means. So isn't there sort of an alternative set of providers that makes it possible for you to access different kind of pathways of treatments? Or how much did you have to do yourself versus like what's available on the market to meet that demand?
I thought for a very long time, like, look, I'm at the best hospital, I get the best oncologist. I should not try to do anything in addition. And I learned that is not the right way. I think you can have kind of people have different acceptance for like how much treatment they want, how experimental they want to go, what they can afford, what they can get access to, how their ability to travel. So how much they want to do in addition to the standard of care is very much up to them. But I do believe that every single patient should realize that the best one to advocate for your care is you. And you should, wherever you can, you or your partner or someone involved, it's great if they follow along, if they look at the data, if they ask questions. I think through AI now, it's an amazing opportunity to ask much better questions to your oncologist. And many doctors I've encountered are very supportive of that. And I think any good doctor would be. You have to be, if you have a serious disease, the stakes are the highest for you. You should get involved. You can't just rely on somebody else. They don't have enough time to do the diligence that you have.
Yeah. So help us understand about the liability part. Why can't patients sign away liability when they're informed about the risks? For example, when you're doing parallel treatments and things like that.
Yeah, as a patient, you cannot sign away your liability, even if you would want to. The legal framework in the US has prevented that.
That's to prevent abuse of patients.
Exactly. There's some reasoning behind it. Like
Yeah.
if you could totally sign away liability, every medical provider would require you to do that.
Yeah,
And you could never sue people for malpractice. It has swung kind of the other way. I think there's like the amount of people kind of not living because it was too conservative is many orders of magnitude more than the people saved by the conservative. The system has gone extremely conservative. If you look at a major hospital, a lot of their incidental costs are from kind of lawsuits and payouts from that. And they clamp down on that. And there's very little freedom. Even when your doctor wants to do something, very often they are held back by the chief medical officer and the legal department of the hospital.
So in total, you received 10 personalized drugs and diagnostics and 30 total treatments, if I remember correctly.
So I made 10
You made
drugs
10.
myself. Some of those are personalized. They're unique to me.
Yeah.
Some of those will only work in a minority of patients, and some of those are more broadly applicable. I have not finished making them. Some of them, like CAR-T, are still going. I've received way more than 10 different treatments since kind of stepping up and taking control of my own care. And I've put all of those online as well. So people can see that on OsteoSarc/timeline. You can find what the treatments I've done.
Can you talk a bit more about the technology behind personalized cancer treatments? Because we've seen that on the news lately as well with the Australian man who treated his dog with a personalized cancer vaccine as well.
Yeah, there's different levels. So some people, especially the academic hospitals, will say it's personalized treatment just because they did a test with 500 genes and then select the appropriate drugs based on that. The next level of personalized is like going deeper in the data. So you kind of have personalized diagnostics or matching, and then you have truly personalized treatments where you make the drug for an N of 1 for only one patient, and it should only go to one patient. The what you've seen in the news probably are mRNA vaccines. We know them from COVID. They're potent vaccines. What you do is you sequence the tumor cells, you see what antigens are expressed, which ones you can target, and you build an mRNA vaccine specifically for like the 15 spots you want to hit.
And how available are they right now? Were you able to get them because you have access, or are they? How would it be for sort of an average US person to access these kinds of treatments?
It's not easy. The trials. I looked at the trials that were going on. I was not able to get into any of the trials, and I've been able to collaborate and get something for myself. And I told you that I started companies to make things more accessible to other people.
Yeah. So these aren't commercially available. There are some trials going on with some of these personalized treatments. You also mentioned the single patient IND pathway, right? So but you didn't choose that for those specific treatments in the end, or you did?
By now, I've done 5 single patient INDs.
Yeah,
so 5 times we said, hey, this is experimental. It is not part of any normal trial. We're going to do this. And I was very happy with kind of how supportive the FDA was. Marty, who's now running the FDA, tweeted, I approve 100% of what lands on his desk. But even before, even under the previous administration, we had great experiences because I was kind of a basket case. I did the standard of care, had a very deadly disease. They approved everything in like 72 hours. When they had questions, they were extremely reasonable. So it's a great pathway if you're dealing with something deadly and you've tried the standard of care.
Yeah. So the single patient IND is something to highlight, right? So basically, an IND means an investigational new drug application, right? So you use that typically to do an entire trial of a new drug that costs like more than $1 billion to produce. But a single patient IND is basically, okay, we just want to do it for one patient and we do it as research. So it's not a prohibited drug, right? It's research. So this is a much faster and easier pathway than to get a whole drug approved.
Exactly. Because these are frequently people with very few options, there's an emergency pathway that I used. So you get the 72 hours. And I suspect what they look at, like, does this application look reasonable? Is there a reasonable person making this? Is it structured the same way? Where's the drug coming from? Is it good GMP facility? Where's the injection site? Have they done clinical trials before? Do we recognize some of the names of the responsible doctors on this? I think the FDA has been very supportive. The FDA doesn't want you to die.
Yep. Yeah, we've seen that too. Like when we look at the approvals of several of the accelerated access pathways, single patient INDs, and all of that, they're very fast and almost always approve. So they're just really underused because there's several tens of millions of patients that could need it each year, but there's only several thousands of these applications each year in the first place. And what seems a challenge when I've looked into it is that the biotechs aren't participating in these programs the most, because what do they gain from it, right? So if there's a company and they have a billion-dollar drug pipeline on the line, their fear, which is probably a bit overcautious, is that the FDA retaliates against their trial if there is something bad happening to a patient. And second, they can charge for it at more than at cost, right? So in your case, you did some of the companies yourself to overcome that problem.
I think the biotechs are being reasonable, although it's heartbreaking. The FDA has kind of so far signaled that if you do compassionate use, the single patient IND outside of the trial, You have to report the data, which is very reasonable, but they kind of indicated they will hold that data against the drug if there's an adverse event. Very, very commonly, these single patient situations, there's a lot of variables. People tend to be like in trouble health-wise. It tends to be not as clean. They've had a previous treatments. There's other things going on. They're not as clean as the trial people. And so there's a real risk of, because these people tend to be more sick, are not have other treatments going on or previous treatments, that there's more risk of an adverse event. And if that adverse event is held against your drug in the same way that an adverse event in the rest will be, then it's very reasonable as a company that needs to get the drug to market to save millions to not making that exception for one person. I think the FDA could really make a difference by saying, we will, of course you have to report the adverse events, but our default is going to be to not hold it against the drug. There should be a very high bar for holding it against the drug, because it's very likely a combination of the other things. And I think if the FDA would come out and say that, the biotechs would be much more supportive. Mm-hmm. Currently, it's a risk to the company. So you frequently have to. I've heard of patients like calling on shareholders of the company, boards, the CMO, personal relations, anything to get them to move. And it's reasonable that they're reluctant, considering the guidance so far that's been given. So I think a very small gesture there could have a really big positive effect.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's what we're working towards. But anyway, now you've taken all these treatments. So what is the status of your cancer now?
It's been undetectable for 10 months, not for lack of trying to detect it. So we're in a really good spot.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So now you are building companies to make this more accessible to more people. So can you tell us a bit more about these companies and efforts that you're seeing, that you're self-making, but also you see others do, that you would support or call out or have high hopes in, to make this more accessible to more patients?
Yeah, these companies, we do that under the Even One Ventures brand, and some of them are in diagnostics, some of them are making medicines. I think one of the most counterintuitive companies is just trying to get fresh tissue out of the hospital.
Fresh tissue.
Fresh tissue. If you have fresh tissue as opposed to a fixated tissue, you can run many more tests. So you can run more genetic tests at higher fidelity. The problem is, by default, if you have a biopsy on your tumor, all your tissue goes to pathology, and they will fixate all of it. They will FFPE it to preserve it. At that point, you've foregone a lot of the tests and a lot of the fidelity that could be very, very useful. It's extremely hard to get pathology to give you the fresh tissue. So we've started a company that's helping people in many ways. And sometimes it's getting close to pathology. Sometimes it's reminding them of the legal obligation they have to have the patient be in control of their tissue. We also have temporary tattoos you can put on your forehead to indicate to the surgeon what your preferences are regarding your own tissue. We're trying to do everything we possibly can to get the tissue out. And I've done 3 biopsies, and every single time we ended up with 2 less fresh tissue than we wanted, less or none. And it was extremely frustrating, and we're trying to solve that problem.
Oh, wow. So it's just not standard that the patients get the tissue that was removed from their body with them.
Oh yeah. That's not standard. Not only is it not standard, but like it's
Typically
there's a
thrown away,
big,
or yeah.
there's an extreme reluctance
Okay.
to help the patients.
And that's just one of the companies. What other companies?
So some of the companies are focused in diagnostics, like I mentioned single cell sequencing, I mentioned spatial sequencing, RNA sequencing. I think there's also in diagnostics, it's really cool to see that there's more and more radio diagnostics where you can have a binder, like many cancer drugs, they are specific. They attach to a certain binder. Well, guess what? You can take the binder, attach it to gallium that shows up on a CT scan, and kind of scan where the drug is going to land in your body. That can be extremely useful. And then some of the other ones, I told that it was hard to make an mRNA vaccine. There's also some drug rescues. Because today it's not standard of care to sequence your tumor, it is very hard to have a drug that doesn't work on the majority of patients. And because getting a drug approved for marketing is so extremely expensive, when drugs work on a minority of patients, they are not invested in. And so we're trying to rescue some of these, and revive them, and make sure that they're accessible to people. And also hoping for progress on the work you're doing for Right to Try, where we can bring these drugs, start making them available to people.
Yeah. Yeah, we can talk about also the 14 proposals you made, which include Right to Try, how to fix the system. And I understand these are mostly on a public policy level. What's your general view on public policy in the United States or in other countries? What's the best or effective way that you've seen also as an entrepreneur to effectuate change? And I'm asking simply because, I started my career in public policy in Washington, D.C., and I kind of gave up thinking that, okay, the system is systematically disincentivizing the right kind of changes, and I didn't really see a way to fix it. Now, by doing a company I think I can do something that can benefit, that can unlock some of these things. But sort of the traditional way with sort of lobbying lawmakers and things like that through that I found, okay, there's all these like ways in which it's disincentivized to do the right thing. I was wondering what your impression was.
Yeah, I haven't been able to change a single policy yet, so I'm not sure what the best way is. I presume it takes a village, and I'm glad we're having this conversation here today. There's amazing people like you trying to get change. There's Roxandra, who's doing clinical trial abundance, which I think is super important. You think about biotech R&D spending, like 3% goes into drug discovery. Most of the rest goes into the clinical trials. China is really outcompeting the US in how easy and fast it is to run clinical trials. I think that's a giant lever. I want to make sure I speak up as a patient. I want to inspire other patients to look at what's possible for them. And I think through that, we'll also get more patients who advocate for these things.
Yeah. We had Ruxander here on the podcast as well. So
Amazing.
How we do clinical trials differently is a big topic on this podcast and in my work, obviously. So can you talk about the proposal of Right to Try and sort of generally a drug being accessible to patients after phase 1?
Yeah, I think after phase 1 is complete, after you've proven the drug doesn't have any kind of adverse effects you're not aware of, I think there should be a right for the patients to try that drug. It shouldn't be marketing, so you still need to complete a phase 3 to market it to people. But if people find that drug on their own, or their physician finds it, they should have the right to take it. And then we should collect the data, and we should inform patients about how that data is looking so they can make an informed decision. But right now, there's a big invisible graveyard of people who haven't been able to access the drugs they know would help them. And there's a lot of drugs that would have helped kind of a minority of patients that are now just not making any progress. I think we go from blockbuster drugs to drugs that just work for some people, we should have 100 times more drugs. And I don't think we can afford to spend $2.7 billion on each of them. So there needs to be a different way. And I think right to try after phase one is a great unlock there.
I do think it should be possible to market them because otherwise you don't reach the right patients at scale. But I think phase three should be the barrier for insurance, basically, or for Medicaid. And also, I think you need registration. That's important, right? Because there is already other laws against fraudulent. There's other laws you can use against fraudulent branding and labeling and things like that. And much of the federal laws still apply there, right? So if you are marketing a drug. So I think there should be some protection around that. Like, yes, you shouldn't, of course, you can't market in the entire United States, but still you need to somehow reach the right patients because otherwise I think that's impractical. But you should be registered, right? So there is oversight. So when something happens and you need to report the data to the state or the federal, to the FDA. So, and you need to be registered and all of that. I think this way you'd get the transparency.
Yeah, I totally agree with the registration, and we should also make the reported data. I think we should share it more broadly so people can make a more informed choice.
Yeah, that would actually be very interesting because you also talked about making data available online so others can find cures or solutions. And there's a very your company is an open source company, right? So how can medicine be more open source?
The companies are not necessarily open source, but I've tried to put as much of my own data online as I can. It's on osteosarc.com. It's over 25 terabytes. We also have a bunch of online viewers. And I've talked to a lot of people who said, look, if we can get 100, 1,000 cancer patients to put their whole thing online, treatment timelines, imaging, genetic data, that would really help us think through things, train our models, etc. So there's a real lack of data available. And I think the way to unlock it is through the patients. The patients are in the end deciding what to do. I think in the case of cancer data, like I hope people steal it. Like it's not precious at all. It's not gonna keeping that private. I don't see an upside. The only upside would be if people don't know you have cancer. But a lot of people like share that they have cancer. In that case, I think you can also share a lot of the data without giant downsides.
Yeah, so we talked about right to try and also against protecting companies or having like FDA guidance for companies to that the outcomes of when they give someone a drug under right to try or experimental treatments will not be used against them unless several conditions are met. What about your first proposal, sort of that investigators can choose any federally compliant institutional review board? What is this, another arcane acronym, and why is it a problem?
Yeah, when we started looking at the single patient IND, we thought the FDA would be problematic. They were not. I said I was very positive. But there was something that was much harder than we anticipated. And it is the major hospital institutional review board. It's also sometimes called the ethics committee. And I found these ethics committees to be very burdensome for the patient. The problem is the incentives for these institutional review boards. If they decline something, if they decline to treat someone because they think it's too risky for the patient, there is no consequence for that. People die of cancer all the time. You're never going to get in trouble for that. If they approve something and there's an adverse event and worst thing, the patient dies because of the treatment, they're going to have a lot of scrutiny. And in the past, there were some more lax institutional review boards. And not only did the FDA kind of ask them to get more strict, but they threatened to pull all the clinical trials from that hospital. This is a giant problem for a hospital. Hospitals make sometimes $500,000 per patient on a clinical trial by a commercial company. It's a giant business for them. It's a big income stream. Having all of that pulled is unimaginable. It would ruin your hospital. So these IRBs put the bar incredibly high. Not only do they do that, they're staffed with kind of volunteers that only work at that hospital. And it's led to a culture where it's really hard to get something passed. It's not necessary. There are independent IRBs who are provenly, they're faster, they're cheaper, and they're just as safe as institutional IRBs. But most major hospitals do not allow their own researchers to pick the IRB. And I think it'd be great if there was guidance that is the appropriate thing to do.
Yeah, that you can have one IRB across multiple sites or hospitals for clinical trials. And the investigator can choose it, yeah. What else? The tumor tissue we already talked about. Freedom to have an out-of-state doctor or nurse, also quite obvious. But states like their licensing.
Yeah, but it's completely bonkers that California made it so that I have to get another doctor. Like if I want the opinion of a doctor in New York City, I have to physically check in with that doctor. Look, I'm dealing with cancer. I'm on chemo drugs. I'm not feeling my best. I'm immunocompromised. You're making me fly across the country so that someone can look at my genetic data and give me an opinion. That is bonkers. That is really bad that California did that and a few other states, and they should cut it out. Yep. It's not in the interest of the patient at all. It's in the interest of protecting the income of the doctors in California, and it is unreasonable, and they should stop it.
Yeah, I can tell you that is difficult to change because states like their licensing and they protect the income of their doctors. Even in Montana, which is a very libertarian frontier state, I try to change it so that it basically has reciprocal recognition with the licenses of other states and jurisdiction even. Wanted to see how far I can get, but I very quickly learned, okay, this is going to be it would stop the entire bill if we insist on that, even in Montana. New Hampshire is a bit better. They actually have a very strong licensing amount of licensing compacts. So compacts are agreements with other states where we agree, okay, we accept your medical licenses. So New Hampshire is very strong there. They also have remote telehealth services available, or at least consent to get treatments and things like that. So you don't have to travel into the state to talk to the doctor if it's the right procedure for you, at least. I think Utah is also doing something with telehealth. I think there's more telehealth built in many more states.
I think it's a fundamental freedom. Like if I as a patient seek out a doctor from New York, I think it's ridiculous that a state says I cannot do that. They should disclose that they're a doctor from New York. I don't think the doctors in New York are better or worse than the ones in California. I think there's much more individual variance there than between the states. So this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So for about the manufacturing side, right? So right now, do you have any personal experience on that from producing the vaccines you needed? And so my understanding is manufacturing in general is very heavily regulated in the United States. There's something called GMP, good manufacturing practice, but it's very strict and it's optimized kind of for large batches of small molecules, right? And it's not very well adapted to biologics and to gene therapies and to many new methods such or stem cells, so which aren't even manufactured in a manufacturing facility in many cases. So and there's like a patchwork of different interpretations of GMP. So do you have any? What is it like for you to produce these treatments? These drugs,
it's expensive because the regulations assume you're making 1 million, and then if you make 1 or 10, they are completely overbearing, and no one wants to see worse medicine. But a lot of the things they guard against, we can now catch at the end. So a lot of the GMP is making sure that you can reliably produce the drug. The problem for a patient accessing like an NF1 drug, a drug unique to you, is not whether it's reliable. The problem is the cost. It's very, very expensive. So it would be way better to get the cost down by an order of magnitude, but still have the same guarantees on the quality of the end product. If you inject it, you got to make sure it's the right thing. It does what it says on the tin. But it's okay to take like a 1% risk that you don't get there if it's 10 times cheaper. Because if it's 10 times cheaper, probably 100 times more people can take it. So we need to, for very small batches, we need to shift from looking at the manufacturing to looking at the end control. I would like good quality practices. Make sure it's good. Make sure there's no bacteria in there and all these other things. And I'll give you 2 examples. Right now, if you produce a batch, you fill vials for drug for 1 patient. You need to take 7 vials to prove that the vialing itself didn't contaminate it. That is 35% of the product for some drugs. That is extremely expensive and completely over the top. That practice was initiated when you had 1 million vials produced and you picked 7 at random, and Six Sigma, etc. You can prove it's safe. So it doesn't make sense for a small batch. Same with like freezers. You'd like, just by testing the freezer costs more than the freezer itself.
Testing the freezer costs more than the freezer itself.
And you should have an alarm on your freezer so you know if it's ever gone below temperature, you toss the drug. Totally agree. But you don't have to test it. You can just have it alarmed. And then the worst thing is you take that 1% risk, you have to toss the drug. That is acceptable if it's 10 times cheaper. And these are some simple examples, but it's really insane. Like you have to certify the freezer for every single drug. It's not just you certify it as a freezer. It is completely bonkers what the current regulation is if you make a small batch, and we should really shift to good quality practices instead.
Yeah. So now you have this journey as a patient through the medical system. So, and on the one hand, there's amazing new technology, right? On the other hand, there is very sclerotic institutions, right? So what does it tell us about the prospect or the hope for technological progress that should save many more people's lives, that even in such an advanced time that we're in, we still have many of these institutions that are not optimized the way we optimize things when we work on technology, like you have done all your life?
Yeah, I think we should advocate for change. It is remarkable that China is getting more new innovative drugs to market than us, many more. I did a radioligand treatment there, a radio diagnostic, not treatment, but a radio diagnostic there. It was a much faster experience than here. We are actively looking at like, how can we get more people to China, because they are charging ahead much faster. And if you run out of options in the standard of care, China is starting to become a really interesting option. And it's completely unnecessary. It's not because we don't have the technology or the tools or the people or the talent in the US. It's because the regulations are unnecessarily stifling. They were built for a different time.
Yeah. And it was only about 10 years ago in China that they started to change the regulation. And during that time went from almost 0% in pharma licensing deals to more than 30% now. That's even 2 years ago, so it might be much higher now. which also is a data point that shows that these are not, that yes, you can trust the data, because otherwise you wouldn't get a big pharma company that will really look at the data to buy it from Chinese companies, right? So, if we want to retain clinical trials and talent, even patients in the United States, then we really need to act pretty soon. In
Totally agree.
yeah. So, Sid, is there anything else you'd like to say, sort of about your journey as a patient, on a personal note? How did it affect you or change you? And what would you maybe say to patients that are potentially going through it right now or have their journey ahead of them?
Yeah, it taught me that whatever it is, you're the one responsible for you, first and foremost. And I'm very grateful. It feels like I got a bonus life. I'm also more impatient now, more outspoken. And for other people going through this, I'm sorry that you have to deal with this. Life ain't fair. If people want to talk, I talk to tons of patients. So please do reach out. cancer@sitesid.com.
Thank you, Sid. Your story is a huge inspiration for me and hope for many of us listening out there. So thank you for sharing your story, for going proactively out there to start companies that do it for many more people, putting your data out there and your voice. This is very powerful and hopefully a good starting point to save many more people's lives. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Nicholas.